My name is Eleanor Voss, and the week my grandmother died, I found out my family had already been trying to steal from her for 3 years. I didn't know that yet, standing at her graveside in the cold March rain. I just knew I was the only granddaughter crying, and that felt, even then, like it told you everything you needed to know about the four of us. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for another 5 months, was that somewhere in a filing cabinet across town, there was a paper trail proving that someone in my family had spent years quietly circling my grandmother's land like a vulture waiting for her to get too weak to notice. And that when I finally found it, it wouldn't just change what I inherited, it would end a marriage. It would break my mother's heart in a way nothing else ever had, and it would prove once and for all that the daughter nobody paid attention to had been the only one paying attention the whole time. Let me back up. For 34 years, I was the daughter my family forgot to introduce properly. Not literally, I was there at every holiday table, every birthday, every forced smile for the family Christmas card. But when people asked my mother about her children, she talked to my older sister, Camille, first. Camille the valedictorian, Camille the surgeon, Camille who married a cardiologist with a lake house. And only after a pause, almost as an afterthought, would she add, "And my other daughter, Eleanor. She does something with animals, I think." I was a veterinarian technician. I'd been one for 11 years. I loved the work with a quiet, stubborn devotion that nobody in my family ever asked me about, and my mother made it sound like I mucked out stalls for a living, which, for the record, I never once did. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I didn't grow up hating my family. I didn't spend my life plotting some dramatic reckoning. I just quietly accepted, the way a lot of us do, that I was the daughter who didn't quite count, and I made peace with a smaller kind of love, because a smaller kind of love was what was on offer. You'd be surprised how normal that starts to feel, how invisible the walls become when you've been living inside them since childhood. I still remember, with the strange clarity childhood humiliations tend to have, the year I turned 12 and won the regional science fair with a project on watershed contamination that I'd spent 3 months building in our garage. My mother came to the awards ceremony, but she left 40 minutes early before they'd even called my category, because Camille had a debate tournament across town, and in her words, someone had to be there for the important one. I remember standing on that stage, 12 years old, scanning the crowd for a face that wasn't there, and understanding something about my place in the family that I wouldn't have the language for until much later. Vivian, as it happened, had driven 2 hours to be there instead, without telling anyone, and taken me for ice cream afterward, where she'd asked me to explain the entire watershed project to her in detail twice, because she said she wanted to actually understand it, not just nod along. The one person who ever made me feel like the whole daughter, not the remainder, not the afterthought, was my grandmother, Vivian. Vivian Ashford Voss had been a schoolteacher for 40 years in a small town 3 hours from where I grew up. She had a laugh that filled a room and opinions she never once softened for anyone's comfort. And she lived alone in a 2-story clapboard house on Larkspur Lane that always smelled like cedar and old paper, and in autumn cinnamon from whatever she was baking badly on purpose, because she said perfect baking was for people with nothing more interesting to think about. While my mother chased Camille's achievements like they were her own personal redemption, Vivian chased me. She called every Tuesday, no particular reason, just to ask what I was reading or whether the stray cat I fed behind the clinic finally had a name. She was the only person in my family who ever asked me a question about my life and then actually waited to hear the answer. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't leave much room for hope, I didn't think twice. I was the one who drove 3 hours every single weekend for 14 months. I learned to give her injections when the visiting nurse couldn't make it. I sat with her through chemo that never really worked, held a basin for her at 2 in the morning more times than I can count, and never once made her feel like a burden. Camille visited twice in 14 months. Both visits lasted under an hour. Both times she left before dinner, always with some version of the same excuse: a shift at the hospital, an emergency with her daughter, Brent needing the car. My mother visited more, I'll give her that much, but every visit came stitched together with the same running commentary about the house. "This place is falling apart, Mother. You really should think about selling before it's worth nothing at all." I watched her jaw tighten every single time, watched her change the subject the way you do when you're saving your strength for a different fight entirely, a fight none of us understood yet. There was one visit about 4 months before she died that I've turned over in my mind so many times since. My mother had come with Camille's husband, Brent, an addition that surprised me, since Brent rarely came to anything that involved a golf course or a business dinner. He walked the property that day. I remember it specifically because it struck me as strange even then. He wandered out past the garden, past the old shed, into the wooded acreage behind the house, taking pictures on his phone like an appraiser. When I asked him about it later, he laughed it off. Just curious what's back there, never really explored it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wish now that I had. Those 14 months taught me things about my grandmother I never would have learned any other way, the kind of things you only find out when you're the one sitting through the 3 a.m. hours, not the polite Sunday afternoon visit. I learned that she'd taught 4th grade for 40 decades and could still at 79 recite the names of every student who'd ever struggled to read, because she'd made it her business to sit with each of them until they could. I learned that she'd been quietly sending money to a former student, a boy who'd grown up and fallen on hard times, and never told a soul, because, in her words, generosity you talk about isn't generosity, it's a performance. I learned mostly what it looked like to be truly seen by someone, because she saw me the entire time, even through the fog of pain medication and exhaustion. There was a night in January, maybe 6 weeks before the end, when she was lucid enough to hold a real conversation, and she asked me out of nowhere whether I was happy. Not whether the clinic was going well, not whether I'd met anyone, just simply whether I was happy. I remember being so unused to the question that I didn't know how to answer it honestly at first. "I think so," I finally said. "I don't know if anyone's ever asked me that before." She'd looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face had gone very still and very sad. "That's the thing I regret most, not asking you sooner, not asking loud enough that the rest of them would hear it too, and maybe start asking as well." I didn't understand at the time that she wasn't just talking about affection. I think, looking back, she was already turning something in her mind, already deciding what she was going to do about 34 years of a family that hadn't bothered to ask. There was another moment closer to the end that I didn't understand until much later either. Kessler visited her twice in the final 2 months, more than his usual once-a-year check-in, and both times my grandmother sent me out of the room to get some air, which was her polite way of saying she needed privacy. I remember feeling hurt by it, a small embarrassing sting of being excluded even then, even from her. I know now what those visits were. I know now she was quietly rewriting her will, quietly documenting a shell company's paperwork, quietly building a case she hoped she'd never actually need me to use. Vivian died on a Thursday in March, my hand in hers, an old Sinatra record spinning on repeat, because she'd told me weeks earlier that dying to silence sounded unbearably boring, and she refused to give death the satisfaction of a quiet room. The funeral was small. The reading of the will 2 weeks later was not. We gathered in attorney Harold Kessler's office, which smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. My mother, Camille, Brent, and me sitting slightly apart because that had always felt like the natural configuration of us. Kessler was a small, precise man in his 60s who'd handled Vivian's affairs for over a decade, and I remember thinking, as he shuffled his papers into order, that he looked more nervous than a routine will reading should have made anyone. "Before I begin," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to note for the record that Mrs. Voss revised this document as recently as 5 months ago and was, in my professional assessment, entirely lucid and of sound mind at the time. I mention this because she specifically asked me to." My mother laughed, a short, surprised sound. Why on earth would she need to specify that? Kessler didn't answer. He just cleared his throat again and began reading. The bulk of Vivian's investment portfolio went first, a little over $400,000, more than any of us realized she'd quietly built over the decades, split in a way that gave the entirety to Camille. I watched my sister's face carefully in that moment, and I want to be fair to her. She looked surprised, not greedy. Whatever came later, I don't believe Camille walked into that office expecting or angling for anything. Then came the jewelry, including the 3-generation sapphire ring Vivian had worn every day of my childhood, also to Camille. My mother received a modest cash sum and Vivian's car, a 15-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper that none of us had ever asked her about. The bulk of Vivian's investment portfolio, a little over $400,000, more than any of us realized she'd quietly built over the decades, went to Camille. Her jewelry, including a 3-generation sapphire ring, also went to Camille. My mother received a modest cash sum and Vivian's car, and to me went the house on Larkspur Lane. I watched my mother's face do something I'd spent 34 years learning not to notice, a flicker of satisfaction, quickly buried under sympathy. "Well," she said, patting my knee like I'd dropped an ice cream cone, "at least you got something, sweetheart, though goodness knows what you'll do with that old money pit." Camille didn't even try to hide her relief. "Honestly, Elle, you can have it. That place needs a new roof, new plumbing, probably needs to be gutted. I wouldn't want the headache." But it was Brent's face I remember most clearly, because for just a second, less than a second really, the kind of flicker you'd miss if you weren't a person who'd spent your whole life reading rooms for scraps of attention, something crossed his expression that wasn't relief at all. It was closer to alarm. I filed that away without understanding it. I had no idea yet how important that half-second would turn out to be. I moved into the Larkspur Lane house 6 weeks later, mostly because my lease was up, and mostly because I didn't know what else to do with my grief. My mother called it sad in the particular tone she used when she meant something else entirely. Camille texted once, "Let me know if you actually managed to sell it, I know a realtor," and then went quiet for months. The house needed work, there was no denying that. Water stains bloomed across the upstairs ceiling. The kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm I eventually memorized in my sleep. Sun had bleached the runner in the hallway to almost nothing. But it was also unmistakably hers. Vivian's chipped teacups still in the cabinet, her reading glasses folded on the nightstand like she might come back for them any minute. Her handwriting still crowding the margins of every cookbook on the shelf, exclamation points next to recipes she loved, and blunt little notes, "Too much salt, don't be lazy next time," next to ones she hadn't. I spent my evenings, after long shifts at the clinic, slowly working through the house room by room, partly to fix it up, and partly because sorting through someone's belongings is its own kind of conversation with the dead. You learn things about people you never thought to ask while they were alive. I found a shoebox of ticket stubs from concerts she apparently attended alone in her 60s, a stack of unsent letters to a man named Walter I never once heard her mention, a child's drawing signed Eleanor, age 6, that she'd apparently kept taped inside a cabinet door for nearly 30 years, where only she would ever see it. The neighbors were kind to me in a way my own family rarely managed, An older man 2 doors down, Mr. Holloway, stopped by twice a week with tomatoes from his garden and stories about Vivian I'd never heard. How she'd organized a fundraiser for the elementary school library, how she'd once stood up at a town council meeting and argued, successfully, against a developer trying to pave over the old creek path. Sharp as a tack, that woman, he told me once, leaning on my porch railing, sharper than most people gave her credit for. I always figured she knew more than she let on about most things. You know, Mr. Holloway said another time, watching me struggle with a stubborn hinge on the garden gate, there was a fella came around here a couple years ago, before Vivian got sick. Nice suit, nicer car than anybody around here drives, said he was doing some kind of survey for the county. Vivian sent him packing inside of 10 minutes. I asked her about it after, and she just said, "Some people think old women don't notice things, Walter. It's usually the most useful mistake anyone can make around me." I asked him if he remembered what he looked like. He shrugged. It had been a while, he said, and men in nice suits tend to blur together after a certain age. I didn't press further, not then, but I wrote the conversation down in a notebook I'd started keeping, the same notebook where I was slowly, methodically building a timeline of everything that didn't quite add up. I didn't think much of that comment at the time. In hindsight, half this story is made up of things I didn't think much of at the time. It was in the study in early June that I found the first thread of something bigger than grief. I was clearing out an old rolled-up desk when I noticed a drawer that wouldn't budge, not stuck, actually locked, with a small brass keyhole I hadn't noticed on any of the other drawers. It took me 20 minutes of searching before I found the key, taped beneath the desk itself, wrapped in a square of blue felt, like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting. Inside was a stack of folders, neatly labeled in Vivian's careful handwriting. Bank statements, correspondence, property surveys I didn't understand yet, and at the very back, a folder marked simply, "For Eleanor when you're ready." I sat on that study floor for a long time before I opened it. The first thing inside the folder was a letter, 4 pages, dated 8 months before she died, written, I realized, with a lump rising in my throat, not long after her diagnosis. "Dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you finally found the courage to go through my things, and knowing you, it probably took longer than it should have. I loved that about you. There's something I should have told your mother 30 years ago and didn't, because I was a coward about my own family the way we so often are with the people closest to us. This house is not what your mother and sister believe it to be. It never was." The letter explained that the property sat on nearly 4 acres, most of it wooded, unused, forgotten by everyone, including, apparently, my own family, who'd only ever seen the sagging porch and the water-stained ceiling and stopped looking any further. 2 years before her diagnosis, Vivian had been approached by a development company scouting land for a new medical office corridor, part of the county's plan to serve its rapidly growing retiree population. They wanted the land badly enough to offer, in a preliminary letter tucked into the folder, an eye-watering sum, nearly $1.2 million, contingent on a rezoning vote scheduled for the next spring. Vivian had told no one, not my mother, not Camille, not even Kessler, beyond the barest legal necessities. "I know what you're thinking," the letter went on. "You're thinking, why didn't she just tell everyone, sell it, split it, make things easy? Because, Eleanor, I've watched this family divide itself around money like dogs circling a single bone, and I refused to let my last act on this earth be another bone thrown into that fight. I wanted for once for something to go to the one person who never asked me for anything." I turned the page, and that's when I found the part of the letter that changed everything, the part I hadn't been prepared for at all. "There's something else you should know," and I debated for a long time whether to write it down. About 18 months ago, I received a letter from a man representing a company called Ridgeline Corridor Partners, offering to buy the wooded acreage for a fraction of what it's actually worth, a figure so low it insulted me. I had never spoken to anyone about the Tristan. Development company's real offer, not a soul. So I asked myself, how did this man know my land had any value at all? I did some quiet digging of my own, Eleanor. I still had a few tricks left in me, even sick as I was. Ridgeline Corridor Partners is a shell company. It took me weeks to trace the paperwork back through 2 other entities, but eventually I found the name of the man who registered it. It was Brent. I stopped breathing for a moment, sitting on that study floor. I don't know if your sister knows. I choose to believe, for her sake and for the sake of your niece, that she doesn't. I don't know exactly what he intended to do, buy the land cheap and flip it to the real developer for an enormous profit before I ever found out what it was worth, most likely, banking on an old, sick woman not noticing or not living long enough to care. I never signed anything. I never told him I knew. I let him believe his little scheme had failed quietly, the way schemes sometimes do, without a scene. I'm telling you this not to poison you against your family before I'm even gone, but because I need you to be careful, Eleanor. If he tried it with me, thinking I was too old and too sick to notice, he may try something with you, too, once he understands what this land is actually worth. Watch for it. Document everything. And for God's sake, don't let him know you know until you're ready. Your mother will call this house worthless. Let her. Your sister will feel relieved she escaped it. Let her feel that too for now. I am not asking you to gloat, Eleanor. That was never who you were, and I don't want you to become it now. I am asking you to be patient, to do your research quietly, and to let the truth arrive on its own schedule instead of forcing it. I love you completely and without qualification, which is more than I can honestly say I gave freely to everyone in this family. I'm sorry it took me so long. Always yours, Grandma Viv. I sat on that floor and sobbed in a way I hadn't since the night she died. Not the quiet, controlled grief I'd allowed myself in front of others, but something raw, something that had been waiting 14 months, 34 years for permission. Grief tangled together with something colder, something closer to fury, aimed at a man who'd smiled at me across 100 Thanksgiving tables, while quietly trying to steal from a dying woman. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at Vivian's kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning, the folder open in front of me, replaying every family gathering of the last 3 years through this new, ugly lens. The 4th of July, when Brent had asked, almost idly, whether Vivian had ever thought about simplifying her estate. The Christmas when he'd brought up, apropos of nothing, an article about elderly homeowners being taken advantage of by predatory buyers, and I'd thought at the time he was just making conversation. The way he'd always been just a little too interested in Vivian's health updates, always angling the conversation toward how she was holding up financially under the medical bills, a concern that had struck me, even then, as oddly specific for a man who barely called his own mother-in-law on her birthday. I thought, too, about what it must have cost Vivian to sit across from him at those same gatherings, knowing what she knew, and say nothing, to pass him the mashed potatoes, to ask politely about his golf game. I understood, sitting there in the dark, that she'd been doing exactly what she'd later ask me to do, holding a truth quietly, patiently, refusing to let it detonate the family before she'd decided it was the right time. I understood, too, for the first time, just how much strength that kind of patience actually requires. It isn't passivity, it's the hardest kind of restraint there is. By the time the sun came up, something in me had settled into a colder, steadier resolve. I wasn't going to march into anyone's kitchen and start shouting. I was going to do exactly what she'd taught me by example, without once explaining the lesson out loud. I was going to be patient and careful, and I was going to make absolutely sure that the truth finally came out. Nobody would be able to argue with a single piece of it. If you're the kind of person who believes the truth always finds its way eventually, even when it takes its time, this next part is for you. Consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories so you don't miss where this goes. I did exactly what Vivian asked. I said nothing. Not yet. For the next 3 months, I worked quietly with a land use attorney 2 counties over, someone with zero connection to my family, zero connection to Kessler, zero chance of the news traveling before I wanted it to. I confirmed the development company's offer was real, current, and still on the table, contingent only on the spring rezoning vote, which my attorney assured me was overwhelmingly likely to pass, given the county's stated growth priorities. I also asked her to look into Ridgeline Corridor Partners. It took her less than a week to confirm what Vivian had already found. The shell company, registered under a slightly obscured version of Brent's name, dissolved quietly about a year earlier, right around the time I realized with a chill that Vivian's cancer had progressed to the point where visitors stopped talking business in front of her. He'd must have assumed she was too far gone to notice, or too far gone to matter. He'd been wrong on both counts. There was a week right in the middle of all this when I nearly told someone, not Camille, not my mother, my closest friend from the clinic, Priya, who'd listened to me complain about my family for a decade without ever once telling me to just get over it. We were sitting in the break room on a slow Tuesday, and I almost said it out loud, the whole thing, the letter and the shell company, and the number that still didn't feel real to me even typed out on paper. What stopped me wasn't loyalty to Vivian's instructions exactly. It was fear, I think, a small, ugly fear that if I said it out loud before I was ready, it would somehow become less true, or I'd lose my nerve to actually see it through. So I said nothing, and I went back to my desk and I kept researching quietly at night instead, the way Vivian had taught me to do everything that mattered. I also spent an evening going back through old family photos, like you do when you're looking for something you can't quite name. I found one from a 4th of July barbecue maybe 6 years back. Brent standing near the grill, laughing at something, one arm slung easily around Camille's shoulders, looking in every visible way like a man with nothing to hide. I remember staring at that photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the version of him in it with the version I now knew had spent months trying to defraud a dying woman. I've thought about that photo often since, how ordinary betrayal can look, right until someone finally points a light at it. There was one afternoon early in that 3-month stretch when I drove out to the county clerk's office myself, unwilling to leave every piece of this in someone else's hands. I sat in a fluorescent-lit records room for nearly 4 hours, pulling filings, cross-referencing dates, watching the shape of what Vivian had already found solidify in front of me on official letterhead, instead of just in her careful handwriting. There's a particular kind of cold that settles into you reading a stranger's legal paperwork and slowly realizing it isn't a stranger at all, that the name buried 3 layers deep in a registration filing belongs to someone who sat across from you at Thanksgiving and passed you the cranberry sauce. I remember the clerk, a patient older woman who'd clearly seen every version of this exact expression cross 100 faces before mine, sliding a box of tissues across the counter without a word when she saw my hands shaking slightly over the copier. I didn't cry there, but I understood in that fluorescent-lit room that I wasn't just confirming a fact anymore. I was building a case, whether I'd meant to or not, and there was no version of the next few months where I could unknow what I now knew. I drove home that evening with the copies in a manila folder on the passenger seat, and I remember talking to Vivian out loud in the empty car, like I sometimes still do. You knew this would happen. You knew I'd be the one who would actually check. It wasn't a question. I think some part of me had already understood by then exactly why she'd chosen me. I kept working at the clinic. I kept fixing the leaky faucet, badly, myself, because some part of me needed to earn the house before I let myself believe in its worth. I kept having dinner once a month with my mother and Camille and Brent, sitting through comments about my little fixer-upper, watching Brent make easy jokes about my money pit, and I said nothing. For the first time in my life, my silence felt like a choice I was making instead of one being made for me. There was one dinner in late February that tested my resolve more than any other. We were at my mother's house, and Brent had been drinking a little more than usual, loose and expansive in the particular way he got when he felt like holding court. He'd started in on me, good-naturedly on the surface, about the house, asking whether I'd had it appraised yet, whether I'd thought about what it was actually worth, whether I understood that properties like that sometimes had value nobody expected if you knew who to talk to. I remember sitting there with Vivian's letter practically burning a hole in my bag in the other room, watching him fish, watching him try to figure out, in his clumsy, half-drunk way, whether I'd found anything yet. I told him I hadn't had it appraised. I told him I was just enjoying fixing it up slowly, taking my time. I watched something in his shoulders relax, watched him settle back into his chair, satisfied, and I remember thinking, with a coldness that surprised me, "You have no idea what's coming." Camille caught my eye across the table at one point that night, just briefly, just a flicker, and I've wondered since whether some small, unconscious part of her already sensed something was off in the air between her husband and me, some tension she couldn't name yet. I didn't give her anything. I smiled, passed the potatoes, and went back to being the daughter who did something with animals, patient and unremarkable, and as far as anyone at that table knew, exactly where they'd always expected me to be. The rezoning vote passed in April exactly as predicted. 2 weeks later, the development company's formal offer arrived, finalized, $1.2 million for the land, with a clause allowing me to keep the house itself and a half-acre, since the structure sat outside their planned footprint. I sat with that letter for 4 days, and on the third day, something happened that made the decision feel considerably more urgent than I'd planned for. My land use attorney called me, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from her before. Someone, she told me, had contacted the development company's regional office directly, asking pointed questions about additional heirs to the Larkspur Lane property and whether the offer I'd received was truly final, or whether there might be complications worth the company revisiting before they finalized anything. The company, understandably cautious, had put a temporary hold on processing my paperwork while they looked into it. It didn't take much guessing to know who'd made that call. I confirmed it 2 days later. A mutual acquaintance from Brent's golf club mentioned entirely innocently that Brent had been asking around about commercial real estate contacts in the county, dropping my name in a way that made it sound like there might be some family dispute over the land worth getting ahead of. I remember the exact feeling that washed over me when I understood what he was doing. Not panic, exactly. Something colder and more focused. The recognition that a man who'd already tried once to take advantage of a dying woman was now, quietly, trying to muddy the waters around her dying wish a second time, hoping to either delay things long enough to find another angle or scare the company into a smaller, faster deal that he could somehow still find a way into. I called my attorney back and asked her what it would take to shut that down permanently, cleanly, in a way that left him no further room to maneuver. She told me the fastest way was also the most direct one: put the truth in front of the company myself, with documentation, so there was no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit. Which meant I no longer had the luxury of the slow, careful timeline I'd planned. I had at most a week or two before this whole thing either resolved on my terms or spiraled into something messier than I was prepared to manage. I sat with that new reality for a day, and then I decided I wasn't going to have one confrontation, I was going to have two, and I wasn't going to wait any longer to have them. The first dinner, I invited only Brent. I told him I needed his opinion on some paperwork related to the house. An old trick, maybe, but an effective one, because Brent had never once in 10 years turned down a chance to feel important. He arrived at the Larkspur Lane house on a Wednesday evening, comfortable, unbothered, making a joke about the water stain on the ceiling before he'd even sat down. I let him get halfway through his coffee before I set 2 documents on the table between us. The first was the Ridgeline Corridor Partners registration paperwork, his name barely obscured right there on the filing. The second was Vivian's letter, open to the page where she named him directly. I watched every trace of comfort drain from his face in real time. "Eleanor, I can explain. You tried to buy a dying woman's land for pennies on the dollar," I said, and I kept my voice level because I'd practiced this in the mirror more times than I'll ever admit. "Before you knew what it was actually worth, before the rest of us knew. And when that didn't work, you were going to try it with me next, once you figured out I'd inherited it." He didn't deny it. That was the thing I hadn't expected. Some part of me had braced for him to lie, to twist it, to make it my fault somehow for not understanding the complexities of real estate strategy, which is an actual phrase he used later in a different conversation to my mother. But in that moment, at my kitchen table, he just sat there, and something in his face told me he'd known this conversation might come someday, and simply hoped it wouldn't. "It wasn't what it looks like," he finally said, which is, I've come to understand, exactly what people say when it is exactly what it looks like. "Explain it to me then," I said. "Explain what it actually was." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, and for a moment I watched him try on 3 or 4 different versions of an explanation before settling on one. "There was an opportunity. Land like this at the edge of a growth corridor, it happens all the time, Eleanor. People option land cheap and flip it. It's not illegal." "It's not illegal to option land. It's a different thing entirely to set up a shell company specifically so a sick, elderly woman wouldn't recognize your name on the offer. That part you don't get to call a real estate strategy." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him look down at Vivian's letter again at the line where she'd written it was Brent in her own careful hand, and something in his shoulders finally sagged, like a man who understood all at once that there was no version of this conversation where he came out looking like anything other than what he was. "I also know about the call you made to the development office," I added, and watched his head come up sharply. "Asking about additional heirs, trying to stall my deal or scare them into something smaller you could still get a piece of. That's twice now, Brent, once while she was dying and once after when you thought I still didn't know enough to stop you." He didn't try to explain for the first time all evening. He just closed his eyes briefly, the particular look of a man watching a story he'd told himself finally collapse under its own weight. "Does Camille know?" I asked. "No," he said quietly. "God, no." "You're going to." His head snapped up at that. "Eleanor, please, think about what this does. To her, to Lila, to the whole family. Can we handle this quietly? I'll walk away from any claim on the land. I'll sign whatever you want. I just don't see what good it does anyone to blow up an entire marriage over something that never even worked. It didn't work because she caught you, not because you have a change of heart. I don't think you get to take credit for a crime you only failed to commit because the person you were stealing from was smarter than you gave her credit for." He asked me, begged me, honestly, in a way that made me feel something uncomfortably close to pity, not to tell her. He offered, absurdly, to make it right in some unspecified way, as though there were a version of right that involved me quietly forgetting he'd tried to defraud my grandmother while she was dying. I told him I wasn't going to hide it. I also told him I wasn't going to be the one to blow up his marriage over dinner theater. That decision belonged to Camille, not to me, and she deserved to hear it in a way that let her ask her own questions instead of watching me perform her anger for her. I gave him 1 week to tell her himself. I told him if he didn't, I would. He didn't. Instead, I found out later, he spent that week trying quietly to get ahead of the story with my mother, dropping vague comments about how I'd always resented Camille's success and might be stirring up drama over old family land, testing, I think, whether that framing would hold up if it ever reached her. It didn't. My mother, whatever her faults, had never once heard me say a resentful word about Camille's marriage, and she told him so, apparently, in a tone that surprised even her. 8 days later, I called Camille and asked her to come over, alone. I made a proper dinner that night, the way Vivian used to, in Vivian's kitchen, at Vivian's table, using Vivian's chipped teacups for coffee afterward. Camille arrived expecting, I think, a slightly pathetic show of me making the best of it, the way she always had. She commented on the water stain before she'd even taken off her coat, an echo of Brent, almost word for word, which struck me in that moment as its own kind of sad answer to a question I hadn't asked yet. I let her eat first. After dinner, as I poured coffee, I set the same 2 documents on the table between us, along with a third, a printed copy of the development company's finalized $1.2 million offer. I watched my sister read all 3 in order, and I watched her face do something I don't think I'd ever seen it do before. Not the polished composure of the surgeon, not the easy confidence of the golden child, but something raw and unguarded and afraid. "This is worth," she started, staring at the number. "Yes," I said. "And Brent tried to—" She stopped, started again. "He tried to buy it out from under her, before she even knew what it was worth?" "Before any of us knew," I said. "While she was sick, while I was driving 3 hours every weekend to hold a basin for her at 2 in the morning, and you were visiting twice for under an hour, your husband was quietly trying to make a fortune off her dying." I hadn't meant to say that last part with as much bite as it came out with. I'd promised myself, driving to that dinner, that I wouldn't turn this into a scoreboard of who showed up and who didn't. But some things, apparently, you can only hold back for so long before they come out anyway. And I think, in the end, Camille needed to hear it as much as I needed to say it. She didn't defend him. That surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that year. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the papers, and then she said, quietly, "I think some part of me always knew he cut corners on things. I just never let myself look too closely, because looking too closely would have meant doing something about it." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, even through everything else I was feeling. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear tonight." "No," she agreed, "but I think I needed to." She was quiet for a while, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, not drinking it. "Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer, not a kind one." "Okay." "Did some part of you enjoy this, being the one who finally had something on him? On all of us, really?" It was a fair question, and I made myself actually sit with it instead of giving her the easy denial. "For about 10 minutes the night I found the letter," I admitted. "I won't pretend I didn't feel something like satisfaction, imagining the look on his face. But mostly what I felt was tired, Camille. Tired of being the one who has to be the bigger person, tired of being underestimated my whole life, and then finding out the one time it actually mattered, being underestimated was the only reason I was in a position to catch this at all. That's not a victory. That's just exhausting." She nodded slowly, and something in her face softened in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. "I used to think you had it easier than me, less pressure, nobody expecting anything from you, so you could just exist without the weight of it. I used to think you had it easier, everyone's attention all the time. I didn't understand until much later that attention isn't the same as being known." We didn't resolve anything that night, not really. Grief and betrayal don't work on a dinner party schedule. But something shifted between us, some old brittle configuration of golden child and forgotten daughter finally cracking open enough to let something more honest through. two sisters who'd spent 30 years standing on opposite sides of a comparison neither of us had asked for, finally sitting at the same table without it between them. The following weekend, I sat my mother separately, at her own kitchen table this time, and told her everything: the letter, the shell company, the call to the development office, all of it. I watched her move through nearly every stage of disbelief in the span of 20 minutes, first insisting there had to be some misunderstanding, some reasonable explanation Brent simply hadn't had the chance to give yet, then falling quiet as I laid the documentation out piece by piece, then finally asking in a voice I barely recognized, "Did Camille know any of this while it was happening?" "No," I told her honestly. "I don't think so. I think she's spent the last 2 weeks going through her own version of what you're going through right now." My mother sat very still for a long moment, staring at her own hands on the table. "I spent years telling you that house was worthless," she finally said. "I said it to your face more than once. I want you to know I wasn't lying to hurt you, Eleanor. I actually believed it. I never once taught to look closer because I'd already decided what that house was worth before I ever really looked." "I know," I said, and I did know. That was in some ways the whole point of what Vivian had built, not a trap for anyone specific, but a kind of mirror, a slow, patient test of who would look closely enough at the right moment to actually see what was there and who wouldn't bother. She was quiet for a long time after that, and I watched something in her rearrange itself, a lifetime of easy assumptions about which daughter mattered more, finally cracking open under the weight of a folder of paperwork she wasn't the one to find. "I don't know how to fix 30 years in one conversation," she finally said. "I'm not asking you to," I told her. "I'm just asking you to actually see it now. That's all I ever really wanted, if I'm honest. Not an apology tour, just to be seen." I wish I could tell you the story ends with some enormous, satisfying reckoning, Brent frog-marched out of the family in handcuffs, my mother falling to her knees in apology. Real life rarely is that generous, and if I've learned anything from Vivian, it's that the truth doesn't need theatrics to be real, it just needs time, and someone patient enough to let it surface. What actually happened was smaller, slower, and in its own way more honest. Camille filed for divorce 4 months later. It wasn't only about Ridgeline, there were other things underneath, things that had apparently been eroding quietly for years, the way water damages a foundation long before anyone notices the crack in the ceiling. Small dishonesties about money, a pattern of decisions made without her, then explained after the fact in a tone that made her feel foolish for asking. But I think the paperwork with his name on it, sitting in a folder my dying grandmother had hidden in a locked drawer, was the thing that finally made her stop looking away from it all at once. It wasn't easy for her, and I never once treated it like some tidy, satisfying justice, even though a smaller, less generous part of me might have wanted to. Divorce rarely announces itself as a triumph from the inside, even when it's clearly the right decision from the outside. I sat with Camille more than once that year while she cried over a marriage she genuinely believed in, and I learned something I don't think I fully understood before, that being right about someone's character doesn't make it painful to watch the person who loved them grieve what they thought that person was.
Brent, for what it's worth, never faced any formal legal consequence. My attorney explained that without Vivian ever having signed anything or lost money directly, the shell company itself sat in a murky, legal gray area. Unethical, clearly predatory in intent, but difficult to prosecute cleanly, especially years after the fact. That used to frustrate me more than it does now. I've come to believe that not every wrong gets settled in a courtroom, and that sometimes the more meaningful consequence is simply this: being fully seen by the people whose good opinion you'd built your whole comfortable life around, for exactly who you are. My mother took the news of Brent's scheme harder than I expected. Not because she'd particularly liked him, I don't think she ever really had, but because it forced her, for the first time in my memory, to reckon with a version of the family story where the golden child's life wasn't actually the safe, enviable thing she'd spent 30 years holding up as the standard the rest of us should have met. She called me, uncharacteristically, just to talk. Not about the house, not about the money. Just to talk, the way Vivian used to. One of those calls, a few weeks after everything came out, she said something I still think about. "I always told myself I treated you girls the same," she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I don't think that was true. I think I was so afraid of Camille not living up to her own potential that I poured everything into making sure she did, and I told myself you didn't need as much of that because you seemed fine. I never once stopped to ask if fine was actually true, or if it was just what you'd learned to perform for me because I wasn't going to ask twice. I didn't tell her it was fine. I'd spent 34 years telling people things were fine when they weren't, and I'd promised myself, standing in Vivian's study with that letter in my hands, that I was done doing that. "It wasn't," I said, "but I'd rather you know that now than never." She cried on the phone, which I don't think I'd heard her do since Vivian's funeral. It wasn't to fix. One phone call doesn't undo 3 decades of a particular kind of quiet, ordinary neglect, but it was a start, and starts, I've learned, are worth more than we usually give them credit for. I didn't fight my family for the inheritance my grandmother left me, and I didn't need to. The will was airtight, and the truth, once it was out, spoke for itself far better than any argument I could have made. What I did instead was quieter. I set aside a portion of the proceeds and anonymously paid off a second mortgage my mother had never told either of us she'd taken out during a rough financial stretch 2 years earlier. I did it through Kessler's office, and I never told her it was me. Some kindnesses mean more when there's no ledger being kept, when nobody's keeping score of who owes whom. I used the rest to open a small nonprofit clinic for low-income pet owners, something I dreamed about for years and never once imagined I'd have the means to build. I named it, without much debate, the Ashford Clinic, after her. The clinic opened on a bright Saturday in late autumn, almost exactly 2 years after Vivian died. Priya came, and Mr. Halloway drove in with a tray of his wife's cookies, and my mother showed up early to help set up chairs, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that whole year. Camille brought Leela, who spent the entire afternoon following one of our new veterinarians around asking increasingly detailed questions about how stethoscopes worked. I stood on the front steps at one point, watching all of it. The modest ribbon, the hand-painted sign, the small crowd of people I loved gathered in front of a building that existed because a woman who'd been dying had decided, quietly and deliberately, that I deserved more than I'd ever asked for. And I thought about that January night, the fog of pain medication, the question she'd asked me that I hadn't known how to answer honestly. "Are you happy?" I think, finally, I had an answer worth giving her. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane. It looks different now. New roof, no more 2 a.m. dripping faucet, the wooded half-acre kept exactly as she left it, cedar smell and all. Camille and I have dinner most weeks now, sometimes with her daughter Leela, who likes to ask me questions about Grandma Viv the way I used to ask Vivian questions, like there's something worth understanding in the answer. Leela is 11 now, and she has Vivian's exact way of asking a question and then actually waiting, patiently, for the real answer instead of moving on to the next question. Last month, she asked me, completely out of nowhere over dinner, whether I was happy. It caught me so off guard that I laughed before I answered, because it was the same question Vivian had once asked me in a dim bedroom on January night, and I hadn't told anyone that story, not even Camille. "Why do you ask?" I said. Leela shrugged, the particular unbothered shrug of an 11-year-old who doesn't yet know the weight some questions can carry. "Just you seem like it. Happy, I mean. Mom says you used to not be when she was little. I just wanted to check if that changed." I told her yes. I meant it more fully than I think I've ever meant anything. I kept the old roll-top desk, locked drawer and all, though there's nothing left inside it now. I moved Vivian's folders to a fireproof box, the letter itself framed, unglamorously but deliberately, on the wall of my study where I can see it every morning. Some people would probably find that morbid. I find it grounding. It reminds me on the days when old habits creep back in, the reflexive smallness, the instinct to shrink myself so someone else's need for attention has more room to breathe, that someone once looked at the whole, unimpressive, unremarkable seeming shape of my life and decided it was worth protecting with everything she had left. I think about Vivian's letter often, especially the line about patience. I used to think patience was just another word for accepting less than you deserved, for waiting quietly at the edge of a family that had already decided where you belonged. I don't think that anymore. Real patience, I've learned, is trusting that the truth has its own timeline, one you don't get to force, and having enough self-respect to wait for it instead of performing your worth for people who've already made their minds about you. My grandmother gave me a house nobody wanted. What she actually gave me was proof that someone, finally, completely, had been paying attention to who I really was and thought that was worth protecting even from her own family, even at the very end. There's a photograph on my mantle now, one I found tucked in the back of that same roll-top desk. Vivian, at maybe 30, standing in front of the Larkspur Lane house not long after she and my grandfather bought it, squinting into the sun, laughing at something outside the frame. I think about her at that age sometimes, decades before any of this, just a young woman starting a life in a house she couldn't have known would one day carry so much weight. I wonder if she'd be surprised by how it all turned out. I don't think she would be. I think, somehow, she planned for this. Exactly this. Not the specifics, maybe, but the shape of it. A family finally forced to see itself clearly. A daughter finally allowed to stop shrinking. Some nights, sitting on that porch she loved so much, I still talk to her out loud like I did in the car that day outside the county clerk's office. I tell her about the clinic, about Leela's questions, and about the slow, imperfect repair happening between my mother and me. I like to imagine she'd approve, though knowing her, she'd probably also tell me to fix that porch step that still creaks, because comfort, in her mind, was never an excuse for neglecting the details. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one who did something with animals instead of something impressive, the one who showed up without asking what was in it for you, I hope you find your Larkspur Lane too. Sometimes it doesn't look like much at first. Sometimes it takes a little patience and a locked drawer and a woman who loved you enough to plan 3 steps ahead even while she was dying, to understand what you were really given. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know which part stayed with you the longest. And if you haven't yet, consider joining our little community here at Silent Victory Stories. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived versions of them yourselves, and there's something quietly powerful about knowing you're not the only one.